The descent through the atmosphere of Oakhaven was not marked by the screech of burning metal or the frantic alarms of a failing navigation system, but rather by a gentle, rhythmic hum that resonated through the floorboards of the drifting vessel known as the Amber Snail. The pilot, a man who had long ago discarded his formal titles in favor of the simple name Bramwell, sat in a chair upholstered in worn velvet, sipping a cup of lukewarm tea while the sensors mapped the verdant sprawl below. Oakhaven was not a planet of gleaming spires or industrial scars. It was a sanctuary of monumental flora, where trees the size of small moons stretched their crystalline branches into the violet sky, catching the solar winds in their translucent leaves to power the subterranean ecosystems far below. Bramwell watched the telemetry screens with a practiced, easy gaze, noting the way the magnetic currents of the amethyst current tugged at his ship like a friendly hand guiding a child through a crowded market. There was no rush to land, for time on the fringes of the sector moved with the languid grace of honey dripping from a spoon, and the Amber Snail was designed for endurance rather than velocity. The ship was a patchwork of salvaged aesthetics, featuring mahogany paneling from a decommissioned luxury liner and brass fittings that shimmered under the soft glow of bioluminescent moss growing in recessed wall niches. As the vessel dipped below the cloud layer, the vastness of the great arboretum revealed itself, a patchwork of emerald, teal, and deep indigo forests that seemed to breathe in unison with the tides of the nearby gas giant. Bramwell set his tea down on a gimbaled side table and adjusted the manual thrusters to compensate for a sudden updraft of scented air, a fragrant mix of crushed cloves and ozone that heralded the arrival of the spring solstice. He was here not to conquer or to trade in high-stakes secrets, but to deliver a single, fragile crate of heirloom seeds to the resident botanist of the southern pole. The botanist, an individual of legendary patience named Solstice-Under-Sun, had waited 3 decades for this specific delivery, and Bramwell felt a quiet sense of pride in being the one to finally bridge the distance between the distant seed banks and this quiet corner of the galaxy. The landing site was a natural clearing atop a flat-topped fungal plateau, where the surface was cushioned by a thick layer of springy, iridescent lichen that could absorb the weight of a landing craft without so much as a tremor. As the landing struts extended with a hiss of pressurized steam, Bramwell caught sight of a figure waiting at the edge of the clearing, draped in robes woven from spider silk and carrying a staff topped with a glowing amber lantern. This was the piece he had sought when he left the crowded corridors of the Inner Rim, a world where the most pressing concern was the health of a sapling or the coming of the evening rain. The airlock cycled open with a sound like a heavy book closing, and the atmosphere of Oakhaven rushed in to meet him, warm and heavy, with the scent of damp earth and blooming nightshade. Bramwell stepped onto the gangplank, his boots clicking softly against the metal, and took a deep breath that seemed to settle the last of the interstellar jitters in his chest. The figure approaching him did not hurry, their movements fluid and deliberate, reflecting a life lived in harmony with the slow cycles of the arboretum. They stopped a respectful distance away and inclined their head, the light from their lantern casting long, dancing shadows across the lichen. There were no formal greetings required between those who understood the value of the quiet, only a shared recognition of the journey completed and the work yet to begin. Bramwell gestured back toward the hold of his ship, where the crate of seeds rested in a temperature-controlled cradle, glowing with a soft, internal light that promised a future of new growth and color for the plateau. The two of them stood for a moment in the fading light of the primary sun, watching as the first of the orbital rings began to shimmer in the darkening sky, a ribbon of silver dust that divided the day from the night. Inside the Amber Snail, the The kitchen was already preparing a simple meal of roasted tubers and fermented grains, the aroma wafting through the open airlock to mingle with the scents of the planet. Bramwell invited Solstice-Under-Sun inside with a silent gesture, and the botanist accepted with a faint smile that crinkled the corners of their eyes. They sat at the small kitchen table, the wood scarred by years of use and travel, and shared a meal that required no conversation to be fulfilling. The botanist spoke eventually, their voice a low murmur that sounded like wind through the reeds, expressing gratitude for the safe passage of the seeds and describing the garden that had been prepared for their arrival. It was a place of high moisture and sheltered light, carved into the side of a shimmering quartz cliff where the roots of the world trees could provide natural warmth during the frost months. Bramwell listened, feeling the weight of his own long voyage begin to lift, replaced by the simple satisfaction of a task well done and the company of a kindred spirit. They talked of the stars, not as distant destinations or sources of resource wealth, but as lanterns that guided the way for those who preferred the slow paths of the cosmos. As the evening deepened into a true velvety dark, the bioluminescence of the plateau began to wake, turning the clearing into a sea of pulsing neon blues and soft pinks. Tiny insects, their wings like shards of stained glass, fluttered around the lantern light, their movements creating a shimmering haze of color that seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum. Bramwell felt a sense of belonging that he had never found in the high-tech hubs of his youth, a realization that the vastness of space was not an empty void to be feared, but a garden to be tended with care and respect. He knew that his stay on Oakhaven would be longer than originally planned, for there was much to learn about the delicate balance of the arboretum and the secrets held within the ancient seeds he had carried across the light years. The amber snail would remain on the plateau, its engines cooling and its sensors resting, while its captain traded the pilot's chair for the gardener's spade. There were no empires to build here, no wars to win, only the slow, steady work of planting a future that would bloom long after they were gone. In the corner of the cabin, the seed crate hummed softly, a mechanical heartbeat that synchronized with the natural rhythms of the planet outside. Solstice-Under-Sun reached out a hand to touch the metal casing, their fingers tracing the etched patterns of the ancient guild of cultivators, a mark of quality and intent that transcended language. They spoke of the history of these seeds, how they had survived the collapse of the old glass-domed cities and the long winter of the Great Migration, preserved by generations of keepers who believed that life was the most precious cargo a ship could carry. Bramwell felt a profound connection to those nameless keepers, a lineage of caretakers who valued the green over the gold and the slow over the fast. He realized then that his ship was not just a vessel for transport, but a mobile sanctuary, a bridge between the past and the potential of the future. The night air grew cooler, carrying the distant sound of a waterfall cascading down the quartz cliffs, a liquid melody that lulled the senses into a state of profound tranquility. Tomorrow, the work of unboxing and acclimation would begin, a process that could not be rushed if the seeds were to take root in the alien soil. They would need to be introduced to the local microbes, bathed in the specific frequencies of the amethyst current, and shielded from the predatory spores that drifted on the high winds. Bramwell looked forward to the labor, the feel of soil beneath his fingernails and the sight of the first green shoots breaking through the surface of the quartz-dusted earth. He thought of the many worlds he had visited, the sterile stations and the crowded mining colonies, and knew that he had finally found the place where his own roots could find purchase. The amber snail was more than a ship. It was a home, and Oakhaven was more than a destination. It was a promise kept. As he prepared his bunk for the night, pulling a heavy wool blanket over his shoulders, he watched the play of light from the arboretum through the porthole, a kaleidoscope of living color that promised a tomorrow filled with the quiet miracles of growth and the enduring strength of the natural world. The transition from traveler to resident was a subtle one, marked by the changing of clothes and the shifting of priorities from fuel levels to moisture readings. Bramwell found that he no longer checked the long-range scanners for incoming traffic, as few ever ventured this far into the amethyst current, and those who did were usually seeking the same solitude he had found. The days began to blend into one another, measured by the opening and closing of the great night-blooming flowers and the migration of the floating jellyfish-like spores that drifted through the canopy. He spent his mornings assisting Solstice-Under-Sun in the preparation of the planting beds, using a small, handheld sonic trowel to loosen the compacted minerals without disturbing the delicate fungal networks that connected the trees. It was meticulous work, requiring a steady hand and a calm mind, qualities that Bramwell had honed over years of navigating the treacherous asteroid belts of the inner systems. He found a deep, meditative satisfaction in the repetition, the way the physical labor grounded him in the present moment and silenced the lingering echoes of the busy galaxy he had left behind. Evenings were spent on the deck of the Amber Snail, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of bruised plum and burning orange. Solstice-Under-Sun would often join him, bringing samples of local fruits that tasted of honey and sharp citrus, or rare herbs that, when steeped in hot water, produced a tea that induced vivid, peaceful dreams. They shared stories of their respective pasts, Bramwell speaking of the shimmering nebulae and the silent graveyards of ancient starships, while the botanist spoke of the centuries-long cycles of the arboretum and the ancient wisdom buried in the root systems of the world trees. There was no judgment in these exchanges, only a mutual appreciation for the diversity of experience and the common threads of curiosity and care that bound them together. The ship, once a lonely outpost in the dark, had become a hub of community, a small island of warmth and light in the vast, green sea of the planet. As the first week came to a close, the seeds were finally ready to be committed to the Earth. It was a solemn occasion, performed under the light of the 3 moons as they aligned to create a rare, shimmering eclipse that bathed the plateau in silver. Bramwell carried the crate to the edge of the Quartz cliff, where a series of tiered terraces had been carved into the stone. Each seed was placed with care into a pocket of enriched soil, watered with the pure runoff from the upper canopy and covered with a thin layer of protective mulch. As the last seed was tucked away, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the forest, a soft rustle of leaves and a brightening of the bioluminescence that signaled the arboretum's acceptance of the new arrivals. Bramwell stood back, his hands stained with the dark, fertile earth of Oakhaven, and felt a sense of completion he had never known. The seeds were home, and in a way so was he. The journey of the Amber Snail had reached its true destination, not at a port of call or a bustling station, but in the quiet, hopeful silence of a garden waiting to grow under the watchful gaze of the amethyst current. The germination period of the heirloom seeds brought a transformation not only to the quartz terraces, but also to the internal rhythm of the Amber Snail. Bramwell found himself waking before the primary sun breached the horizon, the cabin filled with the soft, pre-dawn glow of the ship's navigation consoles, which he now used primarily to monitor the soil temperature and humidity of the nursery. The ship had become an extension of the garden, its sophisticated environmental processes repurposed to brew nutrient-rich mists that were piped through repurposed fuel lines to the outdoor beds. He spent hours recalibrating the internal sensors to detect the microscopic shifts in the seedlings' metabolic rates, a task that required more finesse than navigating a gravity well. The botanist, Solstice-Under-Sun, visited every morning, bringing vials of mountain spring water enriched with the crushed husks of glow-wasp cocoons, a traditional fertilizer that provided the necessary trace minerals for off-world flora to thrive in the Oakhaven soil. They worked in a comfortable, companionable silence, the only sounds being the soft scrape of stone tools and the distant, melodic whistling of the wind as it navigated the hollow branches of the world trees. As the first sprouts began to pierce the surface of the iridescent lichen, they did not appear as typical green shoots, but as tiny, translucent curls of crystalline structure that shimmered with a pale violet light. These were the silver-veined star lilies, a species thought extinct on their home world, but preserved in the cryovaults of the seed banks for centuries. Seeing them take their first breaths of Oakhaven air was a moment of profound significance for Bramwell, a physical manifestation of the continuity of life across the stars. He watched as the seedlings unfurled their delicate fronds, reaching upward toward the amethyst current as if recognizing a kindred energy in the celestial flows above. The air around the terraces began to change, taking on a sweet, ozone-heavy scent that attracted the local pollinators, slender, multi-winged creatures that moved like liquid mercury through the air. These creatures, which Solstice-Under-Sun called shimmer moths, began to congregate around the nursery, their vibrating wings creating a low-frequency hum that seemed to encourage the plants to grow faster, a symbiotic relationship that the botanist watched with keen, appreciative eyes. The complexity of the arboretum's ecosystem became more apparent to Bramwell as he spent more time outside the confines of his ship. He learned that the quartz cliffs were not merely geological formations, but ancient, fossilized root systems of a previous generation of world trees, providing a mineral-rich foundation that was uniquely suited for the star lilies. The amethyst current, the swirling belt of ionized gas and dust that ringed the planet, acted as a secondary sun, providing a constant stream of high-energy particles that the local flora had evolved to harvest. By day, the sky was a canvas of shifting purples and deep indigos, and by night, the rings glowed with a fierce, ethereal brilliance that made artificial lighting unnecessary. Bramwell began to shed his heavy pilot's gear, opting instead for the light, breathable fabrics favored by the locals, materials woven from the inner bark of the silk trees that felt like a second skin. He felt lighter, both physically and mentally, as if the gravity of his former life was being slowly stripped away by the gentle winds of Oakhaven. Inside the amber snail, the transformation continued as Bramwell began to integrate the local botany into the ship's living quarters. He installed hanging planters made from polished seed pods, filled with trailing vines that produced small, glowing berries that could be eaten or used as a natural dye. The mechanical smell of grease and recycled air was replaced by the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth, making the ship feel less like a machine and more like a living organism. He spent his evenings documenting the progress of the garden in a physical ledger, using a quill made from a fallen feather of a cloudhawk and ink pressed from the berries of the shadow fern. This manual recording felt more permanent and meaningful than the digital logs he had kept for years, a way of grounding his experiences in the physical reality of the planet. Solstice-Under-Sun often sat with him, providing the names and properties of the local plants, their voice a steady anchor in the sea of new information. One afternoon, as the secondary sun began to dip behind the great canopy, a sudden change in the atmosphere occurred. The air grew heavy and still, and the vibrant colors of the forest seemed to mute into shades of gray and silver. Solstice-Under-Sun looked toward the horizon with a focused intensity, their hand gripping the amber-topped staff until their knuckles turned white. They explained that a glass storm was approaching, a rare atmospheric event where the high-altitude ice crystals from the rings were pulled down into the lower atmosphere by a shift in the magnetic currents. These storms were beautiful but dangerous, as the falling crystals could shear through unprotected foliage like microscopic razors. Bramwell immediately sprang into action, activating the ship's external shield generators, not to protect the vessel, but to extend a protective canopy over the delicate star lily terraces. He worked with a frantic but controlled energy, dragging heavy tarpaulins made of reinforced fiber mesh across the beds and securing them with heavy stones. The storm arrived with a sound like 1,000 glass chimes shattering at once, a high-pitched, crystalline roar that drowned out all other noise. The sky turned a brilliant, blinding white as the ice crystals caught the last rays of the sun, swirling in violent eddies that lashed against the amber snail's hull. From inside the cockpit, Bramwell and the botanist watched as the world outside was obscured by a shimmering veil of frozen light. The ship groaned under the pressure, its stabilizers working overtime to keep it level on the fungal plateau, while the shield hummed with a fierce blue energy as it deflected the worst of the abrasive ice. It was a terrifyingly beautiful display of planetary power, a reminder that for all its tranquility, Oakhaven was a world of immense and sometimes volatile forces. They sat in the dim light of the cabin, the only heat coming from a small stove where a pot of broth simmered, the steam rising in lazy curls that contrasted with the chaos outside. The storm lasted for several hours, finally tapering off into a gentle snowfall of powdered ice that coated the landscape in a layer of sparkling white. When Bramwell finally ventured outside, he found the plateau transformed into a winter wonderland of crystalline beauty. The star lilies, protected by the shield and the tarpaulins, were unharmed, their violet light glowing softly through the thin layer of frost that had managed to seep in. Solstice-Under-Sun walked among the beds, their expression one of immense relief as they inspected each seedling with practiced care. The storm had left a gift in its wake. The ice crystals were rich in rare gases from the rings, which would melt into the soil and provide a burst of concentrated nutrients for the plants. The arboretum seemed to wake up with renewed vigor, the trees shaking off the frost with a rustle of leaves that sounded like applause. In the days following the storm, the star lilies underwent a growth spurt that was nothing short of miraculous. Their stems thickened into translucent stalks that resembled spun glass, and their buds swelled until they were the size of a man's fist, pulsing with an internal light that changed color depending on the time of day. Bramwell found himself spending more time simply observing the garden, fascinated by the intricate geometry of the petals and the way they seemed to hum in harmony with the amethyst current. He realized that his role had shifted from a mere deliveryman to a guardian, a witness to the unfolding of a new chapter in the planet's history. The connection he felt to the land was deepening, a sense of stewardship that gave his life a purpose beyond the next delivery or the next paycheck. He began to understand why Solstice-Under-Sun had chosen this solitary life, for in the quiet observation of nature, one could find a clarity and a peace that no city could offer. The botanist began to teach Bramwell the art of grafting the light, a technique used to merge the energies of different plants to create new, more resilient hybrids. It involved a deep understanding of the subtle vibrations of the flora and a steady hand to make the precise incisions required for the graft to take. They spent long afternoons in the shaded glades of the lower forest, collecting samples of bioluminescent moss and grafting them onto the trunks of the smaller trees to create natural lanterns that would guide travelers through the darker parts of the woods. This work felt like a form of art, a creative expression that honored the natural world while subtly enhancing its beauty and utility. Bramwell discovered a hidden talent for this delicate work, his long fingers finding the rhythm of the plants with an ease that surprised even the experienced botanist. As the chapter of the first bloom approached, the anticipation on the plateau was palpable. The star lilies were nearly ready to open, their petals vibrating with an intensity that could be felt in the very air. Bramwell prepared the amber snail for the event, clearing the deck and setting up a series of reflectors to capture and amplify the light of the blooming flowers. He wanted to ensure that the beauty of the moment was shared with the entire valley, a beacon of hope and renewal that would be visible for miles. Solstice-Under-Sun prepared a special ceremonial incense, a blend of dried herbs and resins that would enhance the olfactory experience of the bloom, creating a sensory tapestry that would linger in the memory of all who witnessed it. The night of the expected bloom was clear and still, the moons hanging like polished pearls in the violet sky, their light reflecting off the snow-dusted quartz cliffs in a display of quiet majesty. They sat on the edge of the terrace, the air cool and crisp, waiting for the first petal to unfurl. The star lilies were glowing with a fierce, steady violet light, their stems swaying gently in a phantom breeze. Suddenly, a low, resonant chime sounded from the center of the nursery, followed by another and another as the buds began to open. The light that spilled out was not just a color, but a physical sensation, a wave of warmth and vitality that washed over Bramwell and the botanist. Each flower revealed a complex interior of shimmering filaments and glowing pollen that floated into the air like golden dust. The fragrance was overwhelming, a mix of ancient rain, crushed vanilla, and the cold, clean scent of the stars. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated beauty, a testament to the resilience of life and the power of care and patience. As the golden pollen drifted upward, it was caught by the amethyst current, creating a shimmering trail of light that stretched across the sky. The forest responded with a chorus of bioluminescence, every tree and every leaf brightening in a collective salute to the new arrivals. Bramwell felt a profound sense of awe, a realization that he was part of something much larger than himself, a grand, cosmic dance of growth and decay, of light and shadow. He looked at Solstice-Under-Sun and saw tears shimmering in the botanist's eyes, a reflection of the same deep emotion that was swelling in his own heart. They had done it. They had brought a piece of the past back to life, and in doing so, they had secured a future for the star lilies on the hospitable soil of Oakhaven. The amber snail sat in the background, its metallic hull glowing with the reflected light of the flowers, no longer just a ship, but a silent witness to the miracle of the garden. The bloom lasted throughout the night, the light only fading as the primary sun began to rise, painting the sky in competing shades of gold and violet. As the petals finally closed, the seedlings looked stronger, their stems now a deep, hardy purple that spoke of their successful acclimation to the planet. Bramwell felt a pleasant exhaustion, the kind that comes from a long night of shared wonder. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the star lilies would need continued care, and that there were many more seeds in the vaults of the amber snail waiting for their turn to be planted. He looked forward to the years ahead, to the slow, steady work of building a sanctuary of life in the heart of the amethyst current. The galaxy was wide and often cold, but here, on this small fungal plateau, there was warmth, there was light, and there was a garden that would grow forever under the watchful eyes of its keepers. The successful blooming of the silver-veined star lilies marked a shift in the ecological status of the fungal plateau, drawing the attention of the deeper, more ancient residents of the great arboretum. Bramwell noticed the change first in the soil conductivity readings on the amber snail's modified sensors, which began to register a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse emanating from several kilometers beneath the quartz crust. It was a slow, steady vibration, like the heartbeat of a sleeping titan, and it seemed to be responding directly to the new bioelectric signatures of the off-world flora. Solstice-Under-Sun explained that the world trees were not merely passive giants, but a decentralized neural network that shared information through a vast web of mycelium and mineral veins. The introduction of the star lilies had been like whispering a new word into a very old conversation, and now the forest was leaning in to listen. This heightened connectivity meant that the garden was no longer an isolated experiment, but a part of the planetary consciousness, a responsibility that Bramwell felt in the very marrow of his bones as he walked the terraces. To better understand this connection, Bramwell began to construct a series of resonance dampeners using scrap copper wiring and salvaged harmonic oscillators from the ship's old communication array. He placed these at the perimeter of the nursery, not to silence the pulse of the world trees, but to translate it into something the human ear could perceive. When he finally activated the system, the air around the plateau didn't fill with sound, but with a profound sense of presence, a weightiness that made the atmosphere feel thick and intentional. He spent his afternoons sitting cross-legged on the lichen, closing his eyes and letting the vibrations wash over him, learning to distinguish the sharp, energetic crackle of the younger saplings from the deep, somber tones of the elders. It was a form of meditation that stripped away the last vestiges of his identity as a pilot, leaving only the gardener, a temporary tenant in a house built of wood and time. The amber snail, meanwhile, had begun to undergo a physical change as well, as the local creeping moss climbed its landing struts and began to weave a green tapestry over the dull grey hull, effectively camouflaging the vessel into the landscape. One morning, the pulse from below changed, becoming more erratic and tinged with a metallic sharpness that unsettled the shimmer moths. Solstice-Under-Sun arrived at the clearing earlier than usual, their expression clouded with a rare display of concern. They led Bramwell to the edge of the Quartz cliff and pointed toward the distant horizon, where the violet sky was being pierced by a thin, dark spire of smoke. It wasn't the smoke of a fire, but the exhaust of a heavy-duty geothermal harvester, a relic of a bygone era that had been reactivated in the neighboring valley. A group of scavengers, seeking the rare isotopes found in the amethyst current's runoff, had set up a crude camp and were drilling into the root systems of the world trees to tap into the thermal energy stored there. The botanical network was in pain, sending out distress signals that rippled through the mycelium, threatening to destabilize the delicate balance of the nursery and the surrounding forest. Bramwell felt a surge of protective instinct he hadn't experienced since his days of navigating through pirate-infested sectors. However, on Oakhaven, violence was a poison that would only further damage the ecosystem he was trying to protect. He and Solstice-Under-Sun spent the next 3 days developing a different kind of solution, one based on the principles of harmonic interference they had been studying. Using the amber snail's long-range broadcast antenna and the resonance dampeners he had built, Bramwell designed a counter-signal that would mimic the natural frequencies of the world trees, but at a much higher intensity. If they could flood the drill site with a specific acoustic vibration, they could cause the geothermal harvesters to vibrate at their resonant frequency, rendering the machinery inoperable without causing a single explosion or shedding a drop of blood. It was a gamble that required precise timing and a deep understanding of the planet's unique acoustics. As the suns aligned to cast the longest shadows of the season, Bramwell initiated the sequence. The amber snail hummed as its power core surged, funneling energy into the broadcast array. The air on the plateau began to shimmer as the invisible sound waves rippled outward, traveling through the atmosphere and the ground simultaneously. For several tense minutes, nothing happened, and the dark spire of smoke continued to rise in the distance. Then, quite suddenly, the smoke turned white as the harvester's cooling systems failed, followed by a distant, low-pitched groan as the metal structures began to buckle under the microscopic stress of the resonance. The vibrations were so specific that they bypassed the biological life in the valley entirely, affecting only the rigid, unyielding steel of the scavengers' equipment. Within an hour, the drilling had stopped, and the dark spire vanished, replaced by the clean, crisp air of the arboretum. The scavengers, realizing that the planet itself seemed to be rejecting their presence, packed up their remaining gear and departed in a battered cargo hauler, leaving behind only the cooling ruins of their camp. The relief that swept through the forest was tangible. The pulse beneath the quartz cliff returned to its steady, rhythmic heartbeat, and the star lilies glowed with a renewed brilliance. Solstice-Under-Sun thanked Bramwell with a gesture of profound respect, a slow bowing of the head that acknowledged his role as a defender of the green. They spent the rest of the evening walking through the nursery, checking for any signs of stress in the seedlings. To their delight, they found that the resonance event had actually stimulated the growth of the roots, which were now weaving themselves into the quartz with a strength that would make them nearly impossible to uproot. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Bramwell realized that the amber snail was no longer just a home or a sanctuary. It was a part of the planetary defense system, a technological bridge that could protect the natural world from the encroachment of the unthinking machine. He began to spend his evenings refining the resonance arrays, creating a permanent network of sensors that would alert him to any future incursions. He also started to experiment with the ship's interior lighting, matching the cycles of the amethyst current to ensure that the vines growing in the cabin were receiving the optimal spectrum of light. The ship was becoming a masterpiece of integrated design, a fusion of high-grade starship engineering and organic botanical wisdom. The smell of the cabin was now entirely that of the forest, a rich, loamy scent that reminded him every time he entered that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The seasonal transition brought new colors to the great arboretum, as the emerald leaves of the world trees turned to shades of burnt copper and deep bronze. The star lilies followed suit, their violet petals developing edges of shimmering silver that reflected the light of the orbital rings like tiny mirrors. Bramwell found that his own sense of time was beginning to stretch, the frantic minutes and hours of his former life replaced by the slow movement of shadows across the plateau. He stopped wearing a watch, instead learning to tell the time by the angle of the amethyst current and the behavior of the local wildlife. When the great migration of the nectar birds began, their wings creating a rainbow of motion against the sky, he knew it was time to prepare for the mid-season harvest of the star lily seeds, a process that would allow them to expand the garden to the lower terraces. Harvesting the seeds was a delicate operation that required them to catch the glowing pods before they hit the ground, as the impact could crack the crystalline shells. Bramwell and Solstice-Under-Sun used large nets made of woven spider silk, standing under the towering stalks as the pods detached in a shower of golden light. Each pod was a marvel of natural engineering, containing dozens of tiny, pulsing embryos that held the potential for a whole new generation of beauty. They collected thousands of them, storing them in the amber snails hold in breathable containers made of hollowed-out bark. This harvest represented the success of their first year together, a tangible proof that the ancient seeds could not only survive but thrive in the modern galaxy if given the right environment and the right care. As the nights grew colder and the frost began to creep across the lichen once more, Bramwell felt a deep sense of contentment. He sat on the gangplank of his ship, wrapped in a heavy cloak of silk wool, watching the stars twinkle through the gaps in the massive canopy above. He thought of the billions of people living on crowded station worlds, unaware of the quiet miracles happening on Oakhaven, and felt a pang of sympathy for them. He had found something that most people never even knew they were looking for, a sense of place, a sense of purpose, and a connection to a living world that was older and wiser than any human civilization. The amber snail was a small speck of metal in a vast ocean of green, but it was his speck, and he would guard it with everything he had. The chapter concluded with a shared tea ceremony between the pilot and the botanist, the steam from their cups rising to meet the mist that rolled off the quartz cliffs. They spoke of the plans for the coming spring, of the new species they hoped to introduce, and of the ways they could further strengthen the bond between the ship and the forest. There was a sense of infinite possibility in their words, a feeling that they were just at the beginning of a story that would span decades, perhaps even centuries. As the primary sun set and the amethyst current took over the sky, the plateau was bathed in a soft, welcoming light that promised a night of peaceful dreams and a morning of renewed labor. Bramwell closed his eyes and listened to the heartbeat of the world, a sound that had become the most beautiful music he had ever heard, a steady reminder that life, in all its forms, was a gift to be cherished and protected. The turning of the seasonal cycle brought a deeper intimacy between the amber snail and the geography of Oakhaven, as the ship's exterior was now almost entirely reclaimed by a species of iridescent climbing ivy known as the weaver vine. This plant did not merely cling to the hull, it integrated its tendrils into the microscopic pores of the metal, creating a biological insulating layer that regulated the internal temperature far more efficiently than the aging climate control systems ever had. Bramwell found that his daily maintenance routines had shifted from checking coolant levels to carefully pruning the vines away from the external sensor lenses and the airlock seals. He treated the ship with the same tenderness one might show an elderly pet, recognizing that the vessel was transitioning into a hybrid entity, a synthesis of the industrial past and the organic present. The botanist, Solstice-Under-Sun, noted that the ship was beginning to emit a unique biosignature that the forest recognized as a beneficial presence, a guardian node within the greater network of the plateau. This new status as a permanent fixture allowed Bramwell to focus on the expansion of the nursery into the subterranean cavities beneath the Quartz plateau. He discovered that the quartz was honeycombed with natural lava tubes and eroded water channels, where the humidity remained constant and the light was filtered through the translucent stone into a soft, ethereal glow. These chambers were the perfect environment for the shadow ferns and the whispering moss, species that thrived in the cool, damp silence of the earth. Bramwell spent weeks hauling crates of enriched soil and installing bioluminescent lighting strips made from the harvested sap of the glow trees. The work was physically demanding, requiring him to navigate narrow passages and move heavy stones to create terraced garden beds, but he found the exertion restorative. The silence of the caves was not an empty thing, but a dense, tactile presence that seemed to absorb the lingering anxieties of his former life, replacing them with a profound sense of subterranean peace. One evening, while charting a particularly deep cavern that branched off toward the roots of a nearby world tree, Bramwell encountered a group of the planet's most elusive inhabitants, the Stone Singers. These were not biological entities in the traditional sense, but clusters of sentient mineral growth that moved with agonizing slowness, their forms resembling jagged pillars of obsidian and amethyst. They communicated through low-frequency vibrations that resonated through the bedrock, a language of deep time and geological patience. Solstice-Under-Sun had spoken of them in hushed tones, describing them as the historians of Oakhaven, keepers of the memory of the planet's formation. Bramwell remained perfectly still, his breath shallow, as the stone singers drifted through the cavern, their crystalline surfaces catching the light of his lantern and refracting it into 1,000 dancing rainbows. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of insignificance, realizing that his entire life was but a heartbeat in the lifespan of these ancient beings. The presence of the stone singers seemed to bless the underground garden, for the shadow ferns began to grow with an intensity that defied the usual botanical laws. Their fronds unfurled in complex fractal patterns that mirrored the crystalline structures of the cavern walls, and they emitted a faint, pulsing rhythm that synchronized with the heartbeat of the world trees. Bramwell realized that by planting in these caves, he was not just growing a garden, but facilitating a dialogue between the surface and the deep. He began to leave small offerings for the stone singers, bits of polished metal from the ship, or drops of nutrient-rich water, and in return, the vibrations in the cavern grew more harmonious, a steady hum of geological approval that made the very air feel energized. The connection between the amber snail, the surface nursery, and the underground sanctuary was now complete, a vertical axis of life that anchored Bramwell to the planet in a way he had never imagined possible. The mid-season rains arrived with a gentle persistence, turning the plateau into a misty landscape of soft blues and grays. The water did not fall in heavy droplets, but as a fine, nutrient-rich spray that the weaver vines on the ship's hull drank in greedily. During this time, Bramwell and Solstice-Under-Sun spent their days inside the amber snail, processing the latest harvest of medicinal herbs and preparing tinctures that would be distributed to the small, scattered communities of the great arboretum. The kitchen of the ship became a laboratory of sorts, filled with the scents of drying lavender, crushed mint, and the sharp, medicinal tang of the bark root. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized by months of shared labor, finding a deep satisfaction in the knowledge that their efforts were contributing to the health and well-being of the planet's inhabitants. The ship, once a solitary refuge, had become a community resource, a center of healing and growth in the heart of the forest. As the rains began to taper off, a new challenge presented itself in the form of a localized fungal blight that began to affect the lower branches of the surrounding world trees. The blight appeared as a dull gray coating that smothered the bioluminescent moss and prevented the leaves from absorbing the energy of the amethyst current. Solstice-Under-Sun identified it as a dormant strain of spore that had likely been disturbed by the earlier activities of the scavengers. If left unchecked, the blight could spread through the mycelial network, threatening the entire ecosystem of the plateau. Bramwell knew that they could not use chemical fungicides, as these would damage the delicate balance of the soil. Instead, they had to find a biological solution, a way to boost the tree's own immune systems and encourage the growth of the beneficial fungi that naturally kept the blight in check. They spent the next several days scouring the deepest parts of the underground caverns, searching for a rare species of whitecap mushroom that was known to produce a natural antibiotic. Bramwell's knowledge of the cave systems proved invaluable, as he led the botanist through the labyrinthine tunnels to a hidden grotto where the whitecaps grew in abundance. They harvested only what they needed, leaving the rest to ensure the colony's survival, and returned to the ship to brew a concentrated infusion. Using the amber snail's external misting system, they sprayed the infusion over the affected areas of the forest, the fine vapor settling over the gray blight like a shroud of healing light. Within 48 hours, the gray coating began to flake away, revealing the vibrant, healthy green of the bark beneath. The forest responded with a surge of energy, a brightening of the bioluminescence that felt like a collective sigh of relief. This victory over the blight solidified Bramwell's role as a true steward of Oakhaven. He was no longer an outsider looking in, but a vital part of the planet's defense against decay and destruction. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the amber snail, which had provided the tools and the shelter necessary for their work, and for Solstice-Under-Sun, whose wisdom had guided him every step of the way. The relationship between the two had evolved into a deep, wordless friendship, a bond forged in the shared experience of protecting and nurturing life. They sat together on the deck of the ship as the first clear night after the rains revealed the brilliance of the orbital rings, the light reflecting off the wet leaves and creating a world of shimmering, liquid silver. Bramwell decided to celebrate the recovery of the forest by hosting a small gathering for the residents of the nearby glades, a group of shy, forest-dwelling researchers and artisans who lived in harmony with the trees. He prepared a feast using the best of the garden's produce, roasted tubers, sweet berry tarts, and a tea brewed from the fermented petals of the star lilies. The guests arrived as the primary sun set, their lanterns bobbing through the trees like earthbound stars. They brought gifts of woven cloth, carved wooden bowls, and stories of the forest's history that spanned generations. The deck of the amber snail was filled with laughter and conversation, a warm island of light in the vast, dark sea of the arboretum. It was the first time Bramwell had felt a sense of true community since leaving the inner rim, a realization that home was not just a place, but the people and the living world that surrounded you. As the guests departed and the quiet returned to the plateau, Bramwell stood by the airlock, looking out over the garden. The star lilies were glowing softly, their silver-edged petals vibrating with a gentle resonance. He felt a deep, abiding peace, a sense that he had finally found his place in the cosmos. The journey of the amber snail had been long and often lonely, but it had led him to this moment, to this planet, and to this life. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more storms to weather and more blights to fight, but he also knew that he was not alone. He had the forest, he had the botanist, and he had the enduring strength of the natural world to sustain him. He went to his bunk and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the rhythmic pulse of the world trees acting as a lullaby that carried him into the heart of the night. The next morning, the suns rose over a world that felt renewed and revitalized. The air was crisp and clear, and the scent of the recovery infusions still lingered in the air, a reminder of the work they had done. Bramwell began his day with a walk through the caverns, checking on the shadow ferns and the stone singers, feeling the steady hum of the earth beneath his feet. He then returned to the surface to join Solstice-Under-Sun in the nursery, where they began the process of transplanting the strongest of the star lily seedlings to the permanent beds on the lower terraces. This was the culmination of months of effort, the moment when the off-world flora would truly become a part of the Oakhaven landscape. As he tucked the last seedling into the soil, Bramwell felt a surge of hope for the future, a belief that even in a galaxy filled with chaos and change, there were still places where life could find a way to flourish in peace and beauty. The chapter concluded with the sight of the star lilies taking root in their new home, their violet light blending with the natural glow of the forest to create a tapestry of color that was both alien and familiar. The amber snail sat quietly on the plateau, its green-shrouded hull a symbol of the successful integration of technology and nature. Bramwell looked up at the amethyst current, the great ribbon of light that spanned the sky, and felt a sense of connection to the entire universe. He was a gardener, a guardian, and a friend to the world trees, and there was no other place he would rather be. The story of Oakhaven was continuing to unfold, a slow and beautiful narrative of growth, resilience, and the enduring power of care. The approach of the Great Hibernation was heralded by a subtle shift in the color of the amethyst current, as the vibrant purples faded into a deep, crystalline sapphire that cast a cool, sharpening light across the great arboretum. This was the season when the world trees began to withdraw their sap into their deepest heartwood, and the bioluminescent mosses dimmed their glow to conserve energy for the long, frigid months ahead. For Bramwell, the transition meant a frantic but focused effort to fortify the nursery against the plunging temperatures and the coming of the heavy, violet-tinted snows. He spent his days in the amber snail's engineering bay, repurposing the ship's auxiliary heat exchangers to create a network of thermal conduits that would run beneath the quartz terraces. It was a delicate task, as he had to ensure the heat was consistent enough to prevent the silver-veined star lilies from freezing without being so intense that it tricked them into a premature spring bloom. He worked with a meticulous intensity, his hands often numb from the biting wind that now swept across the plateau, yet he found a strange comfort in the struggle, a feeling that he was finally earning his place in the ecosystem through sweat and foresight. Inside the ship, the weaver vines had entered a state of dormancy, their iridescent leaves turning a matte charcoal gray that absorbed the meager solar radiation more effectively. The interior of the amber snail felt smaller and more intimate as Bramwell closed off the non-essential compartments to concentrate the life support energy in the galley and the nursery lab. Solstice-Under-Sun moved with an even more deliberate slowness now, their spider silk robes replaced by heavy layers of felted lichen wool that smelled of wood smoke and dried resin. Together, they prepared the winter sleep, a nutrient-dense slurry made from crushed seed husks and fermented minerals that would be injected into the soil surrounding the star lilies. This was not merely food. It was a biological antifreeze that would protect the cellular structure of the off-world plants from the jagged ice crystals that the cold weather would inevitably bring. The botanist spoke less frequently during these preparations, for the forest itself had grown quiet, the usual hum of the world trees dropping to a low, mournful thrum that resonated in the soles of Bramwell's boots. The first snowfall of the season arrived not as delicate flakes, but as heavy, translucent spheres of frozen atmospheric gas that rattled against the ship's hull like a shower of pearls. Within hours, the plateau was transformed into a landscape of stark, monochromatic beauty, where the only splashes of color were the glowing sapphire of the orbital rings and the faint, pulsing violet of the sheltered star lilies. Bramwell had to venture out several times a night to clear the accumulation from the thermal vents, his breath blooming in thick white clouds as he battled the accumulating drifts. He felt like a lighthouse keeper in a sea of ice, his small vessel the only point of warmth in a world that had gone to sleep. During the long evenings, he and the botanist sat by the ship's small stove, the light from the nursery lab casting long shadows against the mahogany walls. They worked on the Legacy Codex, a massive, hand-bound volume where they recorded every detail of the star lilies' growth, the composition of the soil, and the specific harmonic frequencies that had sustained them. This codex was more than a journal. It was a map for those who would come after them, a testament to the fact that life could be transplanted and nurtured even in the most remote corners of the galaxy. Bramwell found himself reflecting on the nature of legacy, realizing that his most significant contribution to the universe would not be the light years he had traveled or the cargo he had delivered, but the garden he had helped create on this silent, frozen plateau. He thought of the seeds still in the amber snail's vault, the golden-haired sungrains, the azure mist vines, and the crimson heart orchids, and imagined a future where the entire Quartz cliff was a riot of multi-world color, a living museum of the galaxy's botanical heritage. This vision kept him warm during the coldest nights, providing a sense of purpose that transcended his own survival. He was no longer just a man surviving a winter. He was a bridge between the past and a green, vibrant future. As the midpoint of the Great Hibernation approached, a deep freeze settled over Oakhaven that threatened to overwhelm the ship's aging systems. The external thermal conduits began to crack under the pressure of the expanding ice, and the power core of the amber snail groaned as it struggled to maintain the necessary output. Bramwell knew he had to make a choice. He could either keep the ship's living quarters at a comfortable temperature or divert all remaining power to the nursery. There was no hesitation in his mind. He moved his sleeping role into the nursery lab, huddling among the glowing plants for warmth, and allowed the rest of the ship to fall below freezing. The walls of the galley frosted over, and the weaver vines turned brittle, but the star lilies remained vibrant, their violet light a defiant beacon against the encroaching dark. Solstice-Under-Sun joined him in the nursery, and they spent several days in a state of semi-conscious meditation, their heart rates slowing in sympathy with the dormant world trees outside. In this state of suspended animation, Bramwell experienced a series of vivid, lucid dreams that seemed to be fueled by the proximity of the plants and the deep resonance of the planet. He saw the world trees as they were in their youth, eons ago, when the amethyst current was a fiery ribbon of plasma and the quartz cliffs were still molten flows of liquid stone. He felt the collective memory of the forest, a vast tapestry of seasons, storms, and the slow, steady march of evolution. He realized that the planet was not just a host for his garden, but a participant in it, a conscious entity that was curious about the new life he had introduced. The star lilies were being integrated into the planetary dream, their unique frequencies adding a new melody to the ancient song of Oakhaven. When he finally woke, the air in the nursery was thin and cold, but he felt a profound sense of connection that no amount of physical warmth could replace. The thaw began as a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks that echoed through the caverns below, the sound of the world trees expanding as the sap began to flow once more. The heavy violet snow turned to slush, and then to rushing rivulets of water that carved new channels through the lichen. Bramwell emerged from the ship, his body stiff and his face weathered by the cold, to find that the silver-veined star lilies had not only survived, but had developed a new, hardy outer layer of bark-like skin that shimmered with the color of the sapphire sky. They had adapted to the winter of Oakhaven, merging their own genetic code with the environmental demands of the planet. It was a triumph of resilience, a proof that the bond between the gardener and the garden was strong enough to withstand even the harshest of seasons. The amber snail, too, began to wake, its power core stabilizing and its weaver vines showing the first hints of returning green. As the light of the primary sun grew stronger, the plateau erupted in a sudden, violent display of life known as the flash bloom. This was the moment when the local flora, fueled by the melting snow and the surging minerals, grew at an exponential rate to make the most of the brief spring. Bramwell watched in awe as the star lilies unfurled new leaves that were twice the size of the previous ones, their silver veins pulsing with a fierce, renewed energy. The shimmer moths returned in clouds of mercury light, drawn by the intense fragrance of the new growth, and the air on the plateau became a thick, heady mixture of life and potential. He felt a surge of energy himself, a shedding of the winter's lethargy as he began the work of clearing the debris and preparing the soil for the next planting. The chapter of the Great Hibernation had come to a close, leaving Bramwell changed in ways he was still trying to understand. He had faced the absolute silence of the void and the biting cold of the planetary winter, and he had come out the other side with a deeper appreciation for the fragility and the strength of life. He realized that the garden was not a static thing to be maintained, but a living relationship to be nurtured through every cycle of the sun. He looked at the Legacy Codex, its pages now filled with the data of the winter, and felt a quiet pride in the record they were building. The amber snail was no longer just a ship that had landed on a planet. It was a seed that had taken root, a part of the landscape that would continue to grow and evolve long after the snows had vanished. As he stood on the terrace, watching the first of the nectar birds return from the southern valleys, Bramwell felt a hand on his shoulder. Solstice-Under-Sun stood beside him, their eyes reflecting the vibrant greens and purples of the recovering forest. There were no words needed between them, for they had shared the silence of the winter and the struggle of the frost. They were the keepers of the plateau, the weavers of the emerald web, and they were ready for the new life that the spring would bring. The amethyst current shimmered overhead, a constant reminder of the infinite scale of the universe, but here, in the small, vibrant world of the nursery, Bramwell had found a scope of life that was more than enough to fill 100 lifetimes. The arrival of the great solar maximum brought a brilliance to Oakhaven that the plateau had not seen in a century, as the amethyst current swelled with solar wind until it resembled a river of liquid amethyst flowing across the heavens. This celestial abundance signaled the time for the great integration, the final phase of Bramwell's mission, where the off-world flora would no longer be a tended curiosity, but a self-sustaining pillar of the local ecosystem. He spent his final mornings on the plateau not with a trowel or a censer, but with a simple wooden flute carved from a fallen branch of a world tree, mimicking the low, resonant hum of the planet to soothe the plants as they reached their full maturity. The silver-veined star lilies had grown into magnificent, translucent pillars that stood twice the height of the amber snail, their silver veins now acting as organic fiber optics that channeled the light of the orbital rings deep into the soil. Bramwell walked among them, feeling the brush of their velvet-soft leaves against his skin, and realized that his touch was no longer that of a master, but of a peer. He had helped them find their voice in this alien choir, and now they were singing back to the stars. The amber snail had become a living monument, its hull completely encased in a symbiotic shell of weaver vines and hardened fungal plating that shimmered like polished jade. Inside, the distinction between ship and garden had vanished entirely. Vines wound around the navigation consoles, and the floor of the galley was carpeted in a soft, self-illuminating moss that provided a gentle warmth underfoot. Bramwell had long since deactivated the primary engines, knowing that the vessel would never again taste the vacuum of the void. Its true purpose was here, acting as a structural anchor for the nursery and a library for the legacy codex. He sat at the helm one last time, looking at the dead screens that once showed the cold coordinates of the inner rim, and felt a profound sense of liberation. The ship was no longer a cage of metal and glass designed to keep the universe out. It was a heart that pumped life into the surrounding forest. Solstice-Under-Sun arrived at the airlock, their presence heralded by the scent of ozone and blooming nightshade, and together they prepared for the final sowing of the remaining seeds from the cryovaults. This final act was a ceremony of trust, where they would release the golden-haired sun grains and the azure mist vines directly into the high winds of the amethyst current, allowing the planet to decide where they would best take root. They carried the heavy canisters to the highest point of the Quartz cliff, where the air was thin and vibrated with the energy of the rings. As the primary sun hit its zenith, Bramwell opened the seals, and the seeds poured out in a glittering stream that was instantly caught by the updrafts. They didn't fall, they rose, glowing with an internal fire as they were carried across the great arboretum to distant valleys and unmapped peaks. It was a moment of absolute surrender to the natural order, a recognition that for life to truly thrive, it must be set free from the hand that planted it. The botanist watched the receding sparks of light with a serene smile, their amber-topped staff glowing with a fierce, approving light that mirrored the radiance of the sky. In the weeks that followed, the fruits of their labor began to manifest in unexpected ways across the planet. Reports came in from distant glades of new colors appearing in the canopy and of the world trees responding with a vigor that had been missing for generations. The integration of the star lilies had strengthened the mycelial network, creating a more resilient and vibrant planetary consciousness that could better withstand the cycles of the galaxy. Bramwell found that his own physical needs had become simpler, his body attuned to the rhythms of the suns and the tides of the current. He no longer felt the urge to move or the anxiety of the passage of time. He was content to be a witness to the unfolding of the eternal harvest. He and the botanist spent their afternoons teaching the local inhabitants the techniques of light grafting, ensuring that the knowledge they had gathered would be preserved and expanded by the generations to come. As the evening of the final day approached, the air on the plateau became exceptionally clear, allowing a view of the distant star systems that Bramwell had once called home. They looked like tiny, cold sparks compared to the living, breathing warmth of Oakhaven. He thought of the amber snail as it used to be, a lonely, clattering machine drifting through the dark, and compared it to the vibrant, green sanctuary it had become. He realized then that he hadn't just saved the seeds, he had saved himself, finding a path out of the sterile, industrial cycle of his youth and into the rich, messy, and beautiful complexity of a living world. He was the gardener of the amethyst current, and his work was finally complete. The Legacy Codex was full, its pages a dense tapestry of wisdom and wonder that would guide the future of Oakhaven long after his own physical form had returned to the Earth. The final transition occurred under the light of a rare triple moon alignment, which turned the entire Great Arboretum into a world of liquid gold and deep shadow. Bramwell stood on the deck of the ship, which was now more of a terrace than a vessel, and watched as the star lilies began their final, most magnificent bloom. The light they emitted was so intense that it seemed to bridge the gap between the ground and the sky, creating a pillar of violet energy that reached up to touch the amethyst current. In that moment, the planet, the ship, the gardener, and the stars were all one, a single, continuous loop of existence that knew no beginning and no end. He felt a deep, abiding peace settle over him, a warmth that started in his heart and radiated outward until he was part of the very air he breathed. He closed his eyes, listening to the heartbeat of the world, and knew that he was home. Solstice-Under-Sun stood beside him, their hand resting lightly on the bark-covered rail of the ship. They spoke of the seasons to come, of the new gardens that would bloom in the southern reaches, and of the enduring strength of the bond they had forged. There was no sadness in the conclusion of this chapter, only a quiet, joyful anticipation for the stories yet to be written by the wind and the rain. The amber snail hummed one last time, a low, mechanical purr that blended perfectly with the song of the forest, and then it fell silent, its role as a machine finished, its life as a mountain just beginning. The plateau was a sea of light, a testament to the power of a single person to bring a little more beauty into the universe. As the moons moved on and the night deepened, the gardener and the botanist walked back into the green heart of their creation, leaving behind a legacy of growth that would shine forever under the watchful gaze of the amethyst current. The story of the gardener did not end with the last page of the codex, but lived on in every silver-veined leaf and every glowing spore that drifted through the canopy. Travelers who ventured near the Quartz cliffs in later years would speak of a ship made of jade and a garden that pulsed with the light of 1,000 worlds. They would tell tales of a man who traded the stars for the soil and found the entire universe in a single blooming flower. And while the names of the empires and the wars of the Inner Rim faded into the dust of history, the garden on Oakhaven only grew stronger, a vibrant, living proof that the most enduring things in the cosmos are not built of steel or stone, but of care, patience, and the unhurried grace of the natural world. The amethyst current continued its eternal flow, a ribbon of light that connected the planet to the stars, and in its shimmering depths, the spirit of the amber snail lived on, a silent guardian of the green.